What if I told you that American scientists built a weapon so devastating it changed the outcome of World War II, yet remained completely secret from the enemy? While everyone knows about the atomic bomb, almost nobody knows about the proximity fuse, a tiny electronic miracle that fit inside a 5-inch artillery shell and killed enemy aircraft without even hitting them. This wasn't science fiction. It was real. It cost over $1 billion to develop, and it turned Japanese kamikaze attacks from America's worst nightmare into a shooting gallery. On May 11, 1945, a single American destroyer used this secret weapon to face down 156 enemy aircraft in 90 minutes and survive. The proximity fuse was so revolutionary that when the Battle of the Bulge erupted, General George Patton called it the funny fuse that won the war. German prisoners described its effects as going through a meat grinder, killed by shells that exploded in mid-air with impossible accuracy. If you want to know how American engineering genius defeated fanatical courage, how a device the size of a milk bottle saved thousands of lives, and why this weapon terrified enemies who never understood what hit them, then hit that like button, subscribe, and let me take you inside one of WW2's greatest secrets. On the morning of August 12, 1942, Lieutenant Commander James Van Allen stood on the deck of the USS Cleveland in the Chesapeake Bay, watching 3 remote-controlled drone aircraft circle overhead at 15,000 feet. The 28-year-old physicist from Iowa had spent the last year developing something military experts said was impossible, a device that could make artillery shells explode near enemy aircraft without actually hitting them. Van Allen had worked 16-hour days at the Applied Physics Laboratory in Silver Spring, Maryland, miniaturizing radio transmitters small enough to fit inside a 5-inch artillery shell while rugged enough to survive being fired from a gun at forces equal to 20,000 times gravity. German scientists had concluded such a weapon was impossible and abandoned their research in 1939. British engineers developed a prototype but couldn't solve the miniaturization and mass production problems. It fell to American ingenuity, backed by unlimited funding and the urgency of total war, to achieve what others considered science fiction. Merle Tuve, the brilliant physicist leading Section T of the NDRC, had assembled a team of the nation's best minds: James Van Allen developing vacuum tubes, Alexander Kosyolkov perfecting the radio circuits, Ralph Baldwin calculating detonation algorithms, and dozens of engineers solving problems nobody had encountered before. The device they created was a marvel of miniaturization that wouldn't be surpassed until the transistor age. Inside a space no larger than a pint milk bottle, engineers packed a miniature radio transmitter and receiver, a battery that activated only when fired, a thyratron trigger tube, capacitors, resistors, amplifiers, and safety mechanisms, 130 separate electronic components manufactured to tolerances of 2/10,000ths of an inch. The vacuum tube alone required a year of development, as existing tubes would shatter instantly under the shock of gunfire. Van Allen tested hundreds of prototypes by dropping them from the 3rd floor of Baltimore's Pratt Library, then subjecting survivors to tests firing them from special guns while measuring which components failed first. The battery presented another engineering nightmare. It needed to provide sufficient power while remaining stable in storage for months, yet activate instantly when needed and function in temperatures ranging from 100 degrees above zero to 50 degrees below. The solution was a wet cell battery using electrolyte fluid sealed in a glass ampule the size of a fountain pen. When the shell fired, the muzzle blast would shatter the glass, releasing electrolyte that flowed under centrifugal force to activate carbon and zinc plates, creating electrical current that powered the radio circuitry. Security surrounding the project was absolute. Workers called it simply the gadget, and most had no idea what they were building or how it would be used. The project employed 10,000 people by 1945, with components manufactured at over 100 factories nationwide. Yet Japanese intelligence never learned of its existence.
Merle Tuve posted signs throughout the laboratory emphasizing that speed mattered more than perfection. I don't want any damned fool in this laboratory to save money. I only want him to save time. Another sign read, "The best job in the world is a total failure if it is too late." By summer 1942, 18 months after the project began, Tube's team believed they had a workable prototype, but belief wasn't enough. They needed combat conditions to test whether their impossible device would actually work or explode uselessly in the sky while American sailors died below.
The Cleveland's gun crews loaded the first proximity-fused shells at 0900 hours, handling them carefully despite not knowing what made these particular rounds special or why civilian scientists crowded the deck with measuring equipment. Captain E.W. Litch had been briefed that morning by Naval Ordnance officers who told him only that these experimental shells represented a potential breakthrough in anti-aircraft warfare and that successful tests would be classified at the highest levels. The drones, painted bright yellow for visibility, began their attack runs at exactly 1000 hours, diving and weaving under radio control to simulate combat maneuvering by enemy bombers. Gunners tracked them through optical sights, waiting for the order to fire, while Van Allen and his team watched with notebooks ready to record every detail. Traditional time-fused shells would have required careful calculation of range, speed, and altitude, then manual setting of the fuse before loading, a process taking precious seconds, during which an enemy aircraft could change course or altitude and render all calculations useless. The new proximity fuses required no such calculations. Gunners simply aimed and fired, trusting that electronic eyes would see what human eyes couldn't and trigger detonation at precisely the right moment. The first salvo fired at 1003 hours, 4 shells screaming into the sky toward a drone that jinked left at the last second. Traditional shells would have missed by hundreds of yards. Instead, at exactly 47 feet from the drone, the proximity fuse's radio receiver detected the return signal reaching threshold strength, triggered the thyrotron tube, released electrical charge from the capacitor, and detonated 7 pounds of explosive D. The blast created a cloud of shrapnel with a lethal radius of 70 feet, and the drone disintegrated in midair, pieces tumbling into the Chesapeake Bay while black smoke marked where it had been. Van Allen's team erupted in cheers, but there were still 2 more drones in the air. The second fell to the next salvo, 3 shells that bracketed the target and exploded simultaneously, shredding it so thoroughly that wreckage scattered across half a mile of water. The third drone survived less than a minute, brought down by a single shell that detonated precisely as it passed underneath the target, sending fragments upward through the aircraft's belly and wing structures. The entire test had taken less than 15 minutes and consumed fewer than a dozen shells to destroy 3 maneuvering targets. Captain Litch immediately radioed Naval Ordnance Headquarters, "Test successful beyond expectations, recommend immediate mass production." The Navy canceled the second day of planned testing. They had seen enough to know that American scientists had just changed the nature of aerial warfare forever. By November 1942, 3 months after the Cleveland test, 5,000 proximity fuses arrived at Pearl Harbor aboard a heavily guarded transport ship, accompanied by strict orders that they could only be used over open ocean, where the Japanese could not recover unexploded shells and examine the secret technology inside. Admiral Chester Nimitz distributed 4,500 fuses to the Pacific Fleet with explicit instructions. These weapons would give American ships a decisive advantage against Japanese air attack, but only if the enemy remained ignorant of how they worked. Ships' captains received sealed envelopes containing technical specifications and tactical employment guidelines, with orders to destroy all documents if capture became imminent. Gunnery officers studied the new weapons with mixture of skepticism and hope. The Navy's Bureau of Ordnance had a history of promising miracle weapons that failed in combat, but the test results from the Cleveland suggested these particular shells might actually deliver on their revolutionary claims. The first combat use came on January 5, 1943, off Guadalcanal's Cape Hunter, where the cruiser USS Helena tracked 4 Japanese Aichi D-3A dive bombers that had just completed an attack run against American positions on the island. Commander Charles P. Cecil ordered his 5-inch gun crews to engage the departing aircraft at 0837 hours, though the targets were already 4,000 yards distant and maneuvering at wave-top height to avoid conventional anti-aircraft fire. Helena's forward battery fired 3 proximity-fused shells in rapid succession, aiming not at where the aircraft were, but at where they would be in the seconds it took shells to reach them. The first shell passed within 30 feet of the trailing dive bomber, its radio fuse detecting the aircraft's presence and triggering detonation that released a spherical cloud of steel fragments traveling at supersonic velocity. The pilot had no chance to evade. His aircraft simply came apart in midair as shrapnel tore through engine cylinders, fuel tanks, control cables, and the thin aluminum skin that Japanese engineers had sacrificed to reduce weight. The Val hit the water in pieces, leaving a debris field that spread across 200 yards of ocean. Lieutenant James O'Brien, Helena's gunnery officer, watched through binoculars as the remaining 3 Japanese aircraft continued their escape, unaware that American technology had just scored the first proximity fuse kill in history. O'Brien's report to Commander Cecil was brief but historically significant. Target destroyed by near miss at extreme range, new ordnance functioning as specified. The engagement received no public attention at the time. Wartime censorship ensured that news of the revolutionary weapon remained classified. Even Helena's crew didn't fully understand what made these particular shells different from the thousands of rounds they'd fired in previous engagements, knowing only that something had changed and that their effectiveness against air targets had dramatically improved. Japanese intelligence officers examining wreckage from the downed Val found nothing unusual. The aircraft had been destroyed by conventional fragmentation, with no surviving components suggesting anything beyond traditional anti-aircraft fire. The secret remained safe. Throughout 1943, proximity fuses spread across the Pacific Fleet as production ramped up at factories in Cincinnati, Philadelphia, and Camden, where workers assembled 500 units per day in January, rising to 40,000 daily by December. The Crosley Corporation retooled its radio manufacturing facility to produce miniature vacuum tubes, while Sylvania, RCA, General Electric, and Eastman Kodak contributed specialized components. Quality control was obsessive. Each fuse underwent testing that simulated combat conditions, with failures immediately traced back through the supply chain to identify and correct manufacturing defects. The cost was staggering, over $1 billion in 1940s dollars, equivalent to roughly $15 billion today, making the Proximity Fuse project comparable in expense to the Manhattan Project that produced the atomic bomb. The difference was that proximity fuses killed enemies by the thousands while remaining completely invisible to enemy intelligence, a secret weapon that Japanese and German forces never understood even as it destroyed them. Admiral Arleigh Burke, commanding destroyer squadrons in the Solomon Islands during 1943, wrote after the war about the transformation proximity fuses brought to naval combat. Mechanical time fuses, which we had been using, only brought down a plane at night by accident. They were good for harassing enemy aircraft at night, but that was about all. When all the 5-inch 38 and 5-inch 25 ammunition was fitted with VT fuses, those fuses knocked down enemy planes by the dozens. Had it not been for those fuses, our ship losses and casualties in the fast carriers in the last half of the war would have been enormously larger. The statistics supported his assessment. In 1943, naval guns fired 36,370 anti-aircraft rounds at Japanese aircraft, with only 25% using proximity fuses, yet those VT-fused shells accounted for 51% of all kills. The lethal fragment area of a proximity-fused shell measured 3,000 square feet, compared to just 60 square feet for time-fused shells, a 50-fold increase in effectiveness that turned anti-aircraft guns from harassment weapons into aircraft killers.
Night combat showed the most dramatic improvements, where conventional time fuses were nearly useless due to the difficulty of visually estimating range and altitude in darkness. Admiral William Bull Halsey's task forces came under repeated night attacks by Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers during early 1943, with Japanese pilots confident that darkness would protect them from American anti-aircraft fire. They were catastrophically wrong. Naval historian Samuel Eliot Morison described one February attack. The night flickered with muzzle flashes, tracers, flares, float lights, and the flaming pyramids of splashing Bettys. 5 of the attackers were downed, and a convoy saved by excellent anti-aircraft formation, in conjunction with fire control radar and the deadly proximity fuse. Japanese bomber crews reported witnessing aircraft exploding from invisible causes, with no apparent shells passing nearby, a phenomenon that contributed to growing fear among Japanese aviators that American defenses had become supernaturally accurate. Kill ratios at night increased by 370% compared to conventional fuses, transforming nocturnal attacks from relatively safe operations into suicide missions that Japanese commanders increasingly avoided. The psychological impact on Japanese aircrew proved as significant as the physical destruction. Pilots who survived encounters with proximity-fused shells reported shells that knew where aircraft would be, explosions that appeared without warning, and the horrifying sight of wingmen disintegrating without being hit by visible projectiles. Japanese intelligence analysts examined pilot debriefings and concluded that Americans had achieved major improvements in radar-directed fire control, never suspecting that the lethality came from the shells themselves rather than improved aiming systems. This misunderstanding persisted throughout the war, allowing American forces to maintain tactical surprise each time proximity fuses appeared in new theaters of operation. By late 1943, Japanese commanders noted increasing reluctance among experienced pilots to press attacks against American surface ships, a hesitation born from the knowledge that American anti-aircraft fire had become far more lethal than doctrine suggested possible. The days when a determined pilot could expect to survive an attack run if he maintained speed and maneuvering were gone, replaced by a new reality where approaching American ships meant flying into walls of accurately timed explosions that required impossible luck to avoid.
On May 11, 1945, at 07:48 hours, radar operators aboard the destroyer USS Hadley detected the first wave of Japanese aircraft approaching from the northwest at 12,000 feet. But this wasn't the usual small raid of a dozen kamikazes. Within minutes, the scope showed dozens of contacts, then 50, then 100, all converging on a small American picket group stationed 60 miles north of Okinawa. Lieutenant Commander Baron Mullaney, Hadley's commanding officer, realized with cold certainty that his destroyer and its companion ship USS Evans were about to face the largest concentrated kamikaze attack of the entire war. Fighter direction officers transmitted urgent calls for air support, but the nearest combat air patrol was 20 minutes away and heavily engaged with other Japanese formations attacking the main fleet near Okinawa's coast. For the next 90 minutes, Hadley and Evans would stand alone against an aerial onslaught specifically designed to overwhelm and destroy them. The Japanese had planned this attack meticulously. Operation Kikusui No. 6, the 6th of 10 massive kamikaze offensives aimed at destroying the American invasion fleet at Okinawa. Admiral Matome Ugaki commanded the 5th Air Fleet from his headquarters in Kyushu, where he had assembled every flyable aircraft in southern Japan for coordinated strikes against American radar picket stations that provided early warning of approaching raids. Ugaki's intelligence staff had identified these isolated destroyer groups as the fleet's most vulnerable point. Small ships positioned far from mutual support, armed with anti-aircraft weapons but lacking the massed firepower of battleships or carriers. If kamikazes could overwhelm the picket stations, Japanese aircraft would have clear approaches to the main invasion fleet. The plan called for waves of aircraft hitting each picket station simultaneously from multiple directions, saturating defenses and guaranteeing that some kamikazes would reach their targets. For Hadley's position, designated Radar Picket Station 15, Ugaki had allocated 156 aircraft, Zero fighters, Betty bombers, Val dive bombers, and even training aircraft pressed into suicide service. The pilots had been briefed that they faced perhaps 2 American destroyers and 4 small landing craft, targets that conventional wisdom suggested could be destroyed if attacked by sufficient numbers willing to die for the Emperor. What the Japanese didn't know was that every 5-inch shell aboard Hadley and Evans was loaded with proximity fuses, turning the destroyers into floating fortresses with firepower far exceeding anything Japanese intelligence had anticipated. Hadley's main battery consisted of 6 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns capable of firing 15 rounds per minute per gun, potentially 90 shells per minute if sustained fire could be maintained. Each shell weighed 55 pounds and carried 7 pounds of high explosive surrounded by a steel casing designed to fragment into thousands of high-velocity projectiles when detonated. With proximity fuses, each shell effectively became a 70-foot radius sphere of death that would detonate automatically when passing near an aircraft, eliminating the impossibly difficult calculations required for traditional time fuses. Commander Mullaney had no illusions about the coming battle. His ship carried approximately 2,000 rounds of 5-inch ammunition, and if the radar contacts represented even half as many aircraft as the screen suggested, Hadley would need to average 1 kill per 13 shells fired, a rate that would have been inconceivable before proximity fuses, but was now theoretically achievable.
The first kamikazes appeared at 0750 hours, diving from 8,000 feet in a coordinated attack from 3 directions designed to split the destroyer's defensive fire. Hadley's fire control radar locked onto the leading aircraft at 7,000 yards, and gun mounts swiveled to track the target as it descended at over 300 miles per hour. Chief Gunner's Mate Harold Foster called out range and bearing adjustments while loaders slammed proximity-fused shells into breaches that had been cleaned and oiled throughout the long night watch. The first salvo fired at 0751 hours, 6 shells converging on the kamikaze's projected position with computer-calculated precision. The lead shell passed within 40 feet of the diving Zero, its radio fuse detecting the aircraft and triggering detonation that released a cloud of steel fragments moving at supersonic velocity. The Zero's engine disintegrated, severing control cables and puncturing the fuel tank, which exploded seconds later and turned the aircraft into a fireball that tumbled past Hadley's starboard side and hit the water 50 yards away. The pilot had no time to adjust his dive or select a different target. From his perspective, his aircraft simply came apart around him for no visible reason. The second kamikaze exploded 200 yards out, caught by a shell that detonated directly above it and drove fragments downward through the aircraft's thin upper surfaces. The third survived long enough to release a 500-pound bomb before fragments from multiple shells shredded its control surfaces, sending it into an uncontrolled spin that ended in a massive splash 30 yards from Evans. Lieutenant Commander Frank Johnson aboard Evans watched the first 3 kills with grim satisfaction, but the radar scope showed dozens more contacts inbound, and the destroyers had exhausted only a fraction of their ammunition in the opening exchange. Japanese tactics called for continuous pressure with no pauses that would allow American gun crews to rest or reorganize their defense. New waves appeared every few minutes, forcing gunners to engage multiple targets simultaneously while tracking additional contacts approaching from different altitudes and directions. The 40mm and 20mm close-range weapons joined the battle as kamikazes that survived the outer defensive zone pressed their attacks to point-blank range, where the proximity fuse's effectiveness actually decreased because shells were traveling too fast to detonate before passing their targets. Gunners learned to aim slightly ahead of diving kamikazes, allowing the proximity fuses to trigger as shells approached rather than passed the aircraft, a technique that required split-second timing and nerves of steel when flaming kamikazes were diving directly at the gun positions.
At 8:12 hours, a Zero carrying a 250-kilogram bomb penetrated Hadley's defensive fire by approaching at wave-top height, where the radar had difficulty distinguishing aircraft from sea return clutter. The kamikaze emerged from the radar clutter at 400 yards, far too close for the main battery to engage, and accelerated toward Hadley's stern, while 40mm gunners tracked it with streams of tracer fire. The aircraft was burning from multiple hits when it struck the destroyer's port side near the aft engine room, its bomb penetrating the thin hull plating before exploding inside the ship. The blast killed 11 sailors instantly and ruptured fuel and steam lines that filled compartments with superheated vapor. Damage control teams raced to contain flooding while fire parties fought blazes that threatened ammunition magazines. Commander Mullaney kept his ship in formation, knowing that if Hadley withdrew, Evans would face the full weight of Japanese attacks alone. The main battery continued firing despite the flames and listing deck, gunners maintaining their posts even as heat from fires below made the metal decks hot enough to burn through boot soles. Evans absorbed 4 kamikaze hits in the next 20 minutes, each aircraft blazing from proximity-fused shell hits, but retaining enough momentum to crash into the destroyer's superstructure. The cumulative damage knocked out radar, severed communications, and started fires that threatened the forward magazine. Commander Johnson gave the order to flood the magazine, sacrificing a quarter of his ammunition to prevent catastrophic explosion that would destroy the ship. At 8:30 hours, Japanese controllers watching the battle from observation aircraft reported to Admiral Ugaki that both American destroyers were burning and dead in the water, with dozens of aircraft still inbound. Ugaki concluded that Radar Picket Station 15 would be obliterated within minutes, opening a gap in American early warning coverage that follow-up attacks could exploit. But the Japanese observation aircraft were too distant to see that, despite the fires and damage, Hadley's main battery continued firing, and Evans' remaining gun mounts maintained their deadly barrage. The proximity fuses had turned what should have been quick victories into prolonged slaughter, with Japanese aircraft falling faster than they could press home their attacks.
By 0900 hours, 70 minutes into the battle, Hadley had fired over 1,800 rounds of 5-inch ammunition, and Evans had expended nearly all of its remaining supply. The ocean around both destroyers was littered with wreckage, shattered aircraft hulls, floating debris, oil slicks burning with orange flames that sent black smoke columns thousands of feet into the tropical sky. The fighter direction tally board showed 112 confirmed kills, with dozens more Japanese aircraft damaged and forced to withdraw before reaching attack positions. But the cost had been devastating. Evans was a floating wreck with 4 kamikaze impacts, multiple fires, and casualties approaching 50% of its crew. Hadley had absorbed 3 direct hits and near misses that had shredded topside equipment and started fires in 3 compartments. Both destroyers maintained formation through sheer determination, their crews fighting fires, treating wounded, and continuing to load and fire weapons that were now too hot to touch without protective gloves. The proximity fuses had performed exactly as designed, but their very effectiveness revealed a limitation that Section T engineers had never anticipated during development. The sheer volume of targets could overwhelm even the most lethal defensive system. Gunners aboard Hadley were engaging aircraft as fast as they could load and fire, but kamikazes kept appearing through the smoke and haze, approaching from different directions at varying altitudes. Gun directors struggled to prioritize targets, often forced to abandon partially destroyed aircraft to engage new threats that had advanced closer to the ships. Proximity-fused shells were turning near misses into kills, but near misses against kamikazes that had already absorbed fatal damage wasted ammunition that could have been directed at undamaged aircraft. The mathematics of defense were brutally simple. If Japanese aircraft appeared faster than American guns could engage them, eventually some would get through regardless of how effective individual weapons proved. At 0905 hours, 4 Marine Corsair fighters from VMF 221 arrived overhead after responding to Hadley's emergency calls for air support. Lieutenant Robert Wade led his flight into the maelstrom of Japanese aircraft still circling the destroyers, his pilots immediately engaging kamikazes that were lining up for attack runs. The Corsair's 6.50 caliber machine guns tore through unarmored Japanese aircraft, many of which were obsolete trainers and bombers that couldn't match the American fighters' speed or maneuverability. Within minutes, Wade's flight had destroyed 9 kamikazes and scattered formations that were preparing coordinated attacks, buying crucial time for the destroyers below to reorganize their defenses and redistribute ammunition from magazines that still had supplies to gun mounts that had nearly exhausted their ready loads. The arrival of additional Marine and Navy fighters over the next 15 minutes marked the turning point. Japanese aircraft that had previously focused exclusively on attacking the destroyers now found themselves engaged by fighters above and anti-aircraft fire below, caught in a crossfire that made survival nearly impossible.
Admiral Ugaki received reports at 0920 hours that American fighters had arrived in strength over Radar Picket Station 15, negating the numerical advantage his massive strike force had enjoyed. Radio intercepts indicated that both American destroyers remained operational despite multiple kamikaze hits, their anti-aircraft fire continuing unabated. Ugaki realized with bitter clarity that his carefully planned attack had failed to achieve its objective. The picket station would survive, American radar coverage would remain intact, and follow-up strikes against the main invasion fleet would face full early warning. The loss rate among his aircraft had exceeded even the pessimistic estimates that assumed American defenses would prove more effective than anticipated. Something had changed in American anti-aircraft capabilities, something that made their defensive fire far more lethal than Japanese intelligence had suggested possible. Ugaki's staff officers proposed theories: improved radar fire control, superior training, better ammunition, but none could fully explain kill rates that seemed impossibly high given the number of American ships and gun mounts involved in the battle. The last Japanese aircraft withdrew at 09:18 hours, leaving Hadley and Evans burning but afloat, surrounded by wreckage from 152 destroyed aircraft. Only 4 kamikazes from the original force of 156 survived to return to bases in Kyushu, where their pilots reported encountering defensive fire unlike anything experienced in previous attacks. The American shells seemed to know where aircraft would be, exploding without warning and without visible impacts. Aircraft that should have survived to complete their attacks instead disintegrated hundreds of yards from their targets, torn apart by invisible forces that pilots couldn't evade or predict. These reports added to growing Japanese awareness that American anti-aircraft technology had achieved capabilities that exceeded anything Japanese engineers could replicate or counter. But even these survivors didn't understand the full truth, that every shell fired by the American destroyers carried a miniature radio station that could sense aircraft and trigger detonation with computer-controlled precision.
Damage control parties aboard both destroyers worked through the afternoon and evening, containing fires, shoring up damaged compartments, and treating casualties that totaled 167 men killed or wounded between both ships. Hadley and Evans remained unstation despite their damage, maintaining radar coverage until relief destroyers arrived 36 hours later. Commander Mullaney filed an after-action report that credited proximity fuse ammunition as indispensable to his ship's survival, noting that conventional time fuses would have resulted in his ship's destruction within the first 30 minutes of the attack. Navy Bureau of Ordnance analyzed the engagement and calculated that Hadley and Evans had achieved an average of 1 aircraft destroyed per 12.3 shells fired, a rate 4 times better than the fleet average and nearly 100 times better than pre-proximity fuse engagement statistics. The battle became a case study in defensive tactics, demonstrating that even small ships armed with revolutionary weapons could survive aerial attacks that doctrine suggested should be overwhelming. Japanese analysis of Operation Kikusui No. 6 concluded that radar picket stations were far more difficult to destroy than pre-battle estimates had suggested. The loss of 156 aircraft to destroy 0 American ships represented an unsustainable exchange ratio that would exhaust Japan's remaining air strength within weeks if such patterns continued. Admiral Ugaki scaled back the scope of subsequent Kikusui attacks, concentrating smaller numbers of aircraft against individual high-value targets rather than attempting to overwhelm picket stations through mass attacks. This strategic shift effectively conceded that American defensive capabilities had reached levels that Japanese offensive tactics could not overcome, a bitter admission that reflected the cumulative impact of proximity fuses across 2 years of Pacific naval combat. By May 1945, Japanese pilots faced American anti-aircraft defenses that were 4 times more lethal than those encountered in 1943, and the gap continued widening as American industry produced proximity fuses by the tens of thousands, while Japanese researchers remained unaware such weapons existed.
Throughout 1944 and early 1945, proximity fuses spread beyond naval applications as Section T developed versions for field artillery, bombs, and rockets. The European theater received its first ground-based proximity-fused shells in November 1944 during the Allies' advance toward Germany, but strict security protocols prohibited their use over land where German forces might recover unexploded rounds and examine the secret technology inside. That embargo ended on December 18, 1944, 2 days after Germany launched the Battle of the Bulge, its last major offensive on the Western Front. General Dwight Eisenhower personally authorized the use of proximity fuses against both aerial and ground targets, calculating that the tactical advantages outweighed security risks at this late stage of the war. The results shocked German forces that had never encountered weapons capable of airbursting with such precision. Traditional artillery required observers to spot shell impacts and radio corrections until rounds landed on target, a process that could take dozens of shells and many minutes. Proximity-fused artillery shells detonated 30 to 50 feet above ground automatically, showering everything below with supersonic steel fragments that penetrated foxholes, bunkers, and even light-armored vehicles. Fire control radar allowed American artillery to engage unseen targets on reverse slopes of hills and beneath forest canopies, destroying German formations that believed themselves protected by terrain. The Hurtgen Forest engagement that General Patton described in his letter to the War Department, where 96 German soldiers died so quickly their bodies looked like they'd gone through a meat grinder, demonstrated the psychological as well as physical effects of weapons that enemy forces couldn't understand or counter. German prisoners of war reported being dazed after proximity-fused barrages, unable to comprehend how American artillery had become impossibly accurate overnight. The shells arrived without warning. Unlike howitzers that fired in high arcs with audible flight time, the high-velocity proximity-fused rounds detonated before targeted soldiers heard them coming. Foxholes provided no protection, and log-reinforced bunkers that could withstand conventional artillery couldn't stop fragments from airbursting shells. German officers interrogated after the battle insisted that Americans must have deployed some new type of weapon, but they couldn't describe its characteristics beyond noting that shells exploded above ground with devastating effect. Security remained intact. German intelligence never captured an intact proximity fuse, and even examination of shell fragments provided no clue to the radio technology hidden in the nose.
The Battle of the Bulge showcased proximity fuses in both anti-aircraft and ground support roles. German Luftwaffe commander Hermann Göring had assembled over 1,000 aircraft for coordinated strikes supporting the ground offensive, gambling that weather conditions would ground Allied air power and allow German pilots to attack without interference. From December 16th through January 28th, Allied anti-aircraft batteries using proximity-fused shells destroyed 1,054 German aircraft, more than the Luftwaffe could afford to lose at that stage of the war. Kill rates were so high that German pilots began refusing orders to fly close support missions over areas defended by American anti-aircraft guns, recognizing that such missions had become suicide assignments. General Patton's assessment that the funny fuse won the Battle of the Bulge reflected widespread recognition among Allied commanders that proximity fuses had provided decisive advantages at a critical moment when German forces threatened to reverse Allied momentum toward final victory. The defense of Antwerp illustrated proximity fuses' effectiveness against Germany's vengeance weapons, the V-1 flying bombs and V-2 ballistic missiles that Hitler hoped would force Britain to negotiate peace. Between September 1944 and March 1945, Germany launched over 2,500 V-1s at the vital Belgian port that supplied Allied armies advancing into Germany. Initial defenses struggled against the small, fast, pilotless aircraft that approached as low as 1,200 feet, below optimal engagement altitude for conventional anti-aircraft fire. Applied physics laboratory engineers quickly modified proximity fuses to detonate at these lower altitudes, and Winston Churchill personally authorized special Lancaster bomber flights to rush the new fuses from Cincinnati factories to Antwerp's defenders. The modified fuses destroyed 79% of all V-1s engaged during the final week of the campaign, with one Allied battery shooting down 48 of the first 75 rockets it faced.
The Great Port remained operational throughout the war's final months, ensuring uninterrupted supplies to armies that would ultimately crush German resistance and end the European War.
Production statistics by war's end revealed the massive scale of American industrial commitment to the proximity fuse program. Over 22 million fuses were manufactured between 1942 and 1945 at a cost exceeding $1 billion, making the project comparable in expense to the Manhattan Project, but far more immediately applicable to combat operations. The fuses equipped shells for every caliber of American and British naval gun, from 3-inch to 16-inch, plus field artillery from 75 millimeters to 240 millimeters, bombs from 100 to 1,000 pounds, and specialized rockets. 8 versions were produced for U.S. Navy weapons, 12 for U.S. Army weapons, 4 for the Royal Navy, and 6 for British ground forces, 70 different fuse variants in total, each requiring specialized tooling and quality control procedures. By late 1943, American factories were producing 40,000 proximity fuses daily, rising to 70,000 per day by war's end, an industrial achievement that matched anything accomplished during World War II. The strategic impact extended beyond immediate battlefield results. Japanese military historians writing after the war identified American technological superiority, particularly in areas like radar, proximity fuses, and fire control systems, as critical factors that negated Japanese advantages in pilot training and willingness to sacrifice. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, who survived the war and wrote extensively about Japanese tactical failures, argued that proximity fuses fundamentally changed the calculus of aerial warfare by making defensive anti-aircraft fire more effective than offensive bombing tactics. The psychological impact on Japanese aircrew proved particularly significant, with veteran pilots reporting that American defenses had become so lethal that survival required luck rather than skill. This erosion of confidence contributed to Japan's decision to rely increasingly on kamikaze tactics. If skilled pilots couldn't survive to complete multiple missions, perhaps suicide attacks by minimally trained pilots could achieve what conventional tactics could not. The proximity fuse thus indirectly shaped Japanese strategy during the war's final year, forcing adaptations that ultimately proved futile against weapons the Japanese never understood.
Post-war analysis by American military strategists concluded that proximity fuses had saved thousands of Allied lives by reducing ship losses, increasing the effectiveness of artillery barrages, and protecting cities against rocket attacks. Admiral William Halsey estimated that without VT fuses, American casualties during the Philippine Sea Campaign would have increased by at least 30%. With ship losses potentially forcing delays in offensive operations that would have extended the war by months. General Eisenhower credited proximity fuses with reducing artillery ammunition expenditure by 25% while increasing effectiveness against German ground forces, allowing Allied armies to maintain offensive momentum despite extended supply lines. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal summarized the weapon's impact in his 1945 statement. The proximity fuse has helped blaze the trail to Japan. Without the protection this ingenious device has given the surface ships of the fleet, our westward push could not have been so swift, and the cost in men and ships would have been immeasurably greater. The technology legacy persists into the 21st century, with proximity fuse principles incorporated into modern weapons systems, including the Phoenix AIM-54 air-to-air missile, standard SM-1 and SM-2 surface-to-air missiles, and the Patriot missile system that demonstrated its effectiveness during the Gulf War. The miniaturization techniques developed for the original vacuum tube fuses anticipated later advances in solid-state electronics and integrated circuits, influencing post-war consumer electronics development. James Van Allen, who developed the miniature vacuum tubes that made proximity fuses possible, later pioneered space exploration technology and discovered the radiation belts surrounding Earth that bear his name. Merle Tuve continued research at the Carnegie Institution, contributing to early radar astronomy and radio physics. The Applied Physics Laboratory expanded from its proximity fuse origins to become a major defense research facility that continues developing advanced weapon systems and space exploration technology. The proximity fuse program demonstrated that American industrial capacity and scientific innovation could achieve results that enemies considered impossible, producing weapons that changed warfare while remaining completely secret from adversaries who died never understanding what killed them. It was, as one historian wrote, the tiny miracle that won the war. A device small enough to fit in a milk bottle, but powerful enough to change the course of history. Japanese kamikaze pilots went to their deaths believing they faced only improved American training and fire control, never knowing that every shell fired at them carried a miniature radio station that could sense their presence and detonate at precisely the right moment. German soldiers died in foxholes that should have protected them, killed by shells that exploded overhead with impossible accuracy, never learning that American engineers had solved problems German scientists had declared unsolvable. The $1 billion secret remained secure through war's end and beyond, a testament to American security protocols and the dedication of 10,000 workers who built weapons they didn't fully understand to win a war they knew had to be won.